It is 3:15 in the morning. George Lutz bolts upright in bed, drenched in sweat, heart hammering against his ribs like something trying to get out. He doesn't know why he woke up. He never does. But every night, every single night, it's the same time, 3:15 a.m., without an alarm, without a sound. He lies still, staring at the ceiling. The house around him is quiet, too quiet. 23 rooms, and not a creak, not a groan from the old wood. Just silence, the kind of silence that feels alive. Then he hears it, a slow rhythmic rocking, coming from downstairs. He tells himself it's the wind. He tells himself the old rocking chair by the fireplace sometimes moves on its own. Drafts, old floors, 100 reasonable explanations. He has told himself these things every night for 3 weeks now. He gets up anyway. His bare feet hit the cold floor, and he means cold. Not room temperature cold, not winter cold. Something beyond cold. Something that seeps into the bone and doesn't let go, even though the thermostat reads 70 degrees. He walks to the top of the stairs and looks down. The rocking chair is moving, back and forth, slow and steady, like someone sitting in it, waiting. The chair is empty. And then, from somewhere deep inside the walls of this house, comes a sound he will never forget for the rest of his life. Low, guttural, almost like a voice, but not quite human. Like something learned to imitate a voice without understanding what a voice is for. George Lutz grips the banister. His knuckles go white. He has a wife asleep upstairs, 3 children asleep upstairs, and he is standing at the top of a staircase in a house on 112 Ocean Avenue, Amityville, New York. A house where, 13 months ago, 6 people were murdered in their beds. He will leave this house in 5 days. He will leave with nothing but the clothes on his back, his family, and a terror so complete, so total, that 40 years later, on his deathbed, George Lutz will still refuse to talk about everything that happened inside these walls. This is the story of those 28 days. And I promise you, by the end of this, you will never look at a house the same way again. The DeFeo family was, by all appearances, living the American dream. Ronald DeFeo Jr. had worked his way up from nothing. His father-in-law owned a chain of car dealerships, and Ronald had clawed his way into the business, made himself indispensable, and eventually moved his family into one of the nicest houses in Amityville, a small, pleasant town on the south shore of Long Island, the kind of place where you knew your neighbors and left your doors unlocked. 112 Ocean Avenue was a 3-story Dutch colonial house, built in 1927. 6 bedrooms, 3.5 bathrooms, a boathouse on the Amityville River. For the 1970s, it was an impressive property. The kind of house that said we made it. The kind of house that said we are safe here. Ronald Sr. and Louise DeFeo had 5 children. Ronald Jr., called Butch by everyone who knew him, Don, Allison, Mark, and little John Matthew. On the surface, they were a large, loud, Italian-American family. Sunday dinners, Catholic school, Little League. But behind closed doors, things were different. Ronald Sr. was a violent man. He beat his son Butch regularly, savagely, sometimes with a belt, sometimes with his fists. Neighbors would later recall hearing screaming from the house. Relatives described Ronald Sr. as a tyrant, controlling, explosive, cruel. And Butch, the oldest, the one who was supposed to one day inherit everything, grew up absorbing their violence, marinating in it, until no one could quite tell anymore where the father's rage ended and the son's began. By his early 20s, Butch DeFeo was a young man in pieces. He abused drugs heavily, heroin mostly. He stole money from his grandfather's dealership. He lied constantly and compulsively. He had once allegedly held a shotgun to a friend's head during an argument. He spoke sometimes about killing his father, about how one day he would make the old man pay. No one took it seriously. They should have. November 13th, 1974. A Wednesday, at approximately 3:15 in the morning. Remember that time? Ronald DeFeo Jr. got out of bed. He loaded a .35 caliber Marlin lever-action rifle, and he walked through his family's house. He started with his parents, 2 shots each. Ronald Sr. first, then Louise. They never woke up. Ballistics would later confirm they were shot while sleeping. No defensive wounds, no sign of struggle. They simply ceased to exist. Then he walked to the room shared by his brothers, Mark and John Matthew. Mark was 12. John Matthew was 9. 2 shots each. Then his sisters. Dawn was 18. Allison was 13. 2 shots each. 6 people, shot in their beds. None of them woke up. None of them ran. None of them screamed. This, investigators would later find deeply disturbing. The rifle Butch used was loud, extremely loud. A neighbor reported hearing a single sound she thought might be a car backfiring. Just one. And yet 6 people were shot in sequence in multiple rooms. Even accounting for some of them being very heavy sleepers, the silence of it all felt wrong. How do you shoot 6 people with a loud rifle in a house without a single one waking up at the sound of the shots that killed the others? Butch DeFeo had an answer. He said he heard voices. At 6:30 that same evening, Butch DeFeo walked into Henry's bar in Amityville, visibly agitated, and told the people there that he had come home to find his family shot dead. Friends drove him back to the house. Police were called. It took less than 24 hours for investigators to identify Butch as their primary suspect. His story kept changing. His alibi fell apart. His hands tested positive for gunshot residue. On November 15th, Ronald DeFeo Jr. was arrested and charged with 6 counts of second-degree murder. In interrogation, he eventually confessed. But the confession was strange. He said the voices had started weeks before the murders. Low, whispering voices inside his head, sometimes inside the walls of the house, telling him that his family was planning to kill him, that he had to act first, that he had to protect himself. He said that on the night of the murders, the voices became overwhelming, irresistible, like a force pressing down on him from the outside. He said he didn't feel like himself. He said he couldn't stop. His defense attorney would later try an insanity plea. It failed. The jury deliberated for less than 5 hours before finding Ronald DeFeo Jr. guilty on all 6 counts. He was sentenced to 6 consecutive terms of 25 years to life in prison. He died behind bars in 2021 at the age of 69. But what he said in that interrogation room, about the voices, about the house, about something that lived inside those walls, would not stay buried. Because 13 months later, a new family moved in, and the house wasn't finished yet. George Lutz was 28 years old, recently married, and trying very hard to give his new family a good life. He had married Kathy in 1975. Kathy was a young widow with 3 children from her first marriage. Daniel, 9, Christopher, 7, and Missy, 5. George had adopted all 3. They were his kids now. That's who he was, the kind of man who did things like that. They needed a bigger house. When the realtor showed them 112 Ocean Avenue, George and Kathy Lutz knew they were supposed to be unsettled by the history. The realtor was legally obligated to disclose it. 6 murders 1 year ago. The previous family's furniture was still inside. The DeFeos had died before anyone could move it, and rather than deal with it, the estate had simply left everything in place. The Lutzes could have it all included in the sale. George and Kathy walked through the rooms. They looked at the price, $80,000. In 1975, for a house this size on Long Island, that was an extraordinary deal, almost suspiciously good. They talked about it. They told themselves that what happened here was a human tragedy, not a supernatural one. A disturbed young man had killed his family. That was horrible. But it didn't make the house evil. It didn't mean anything lingered. They were not superstitious people. They bought the house. On December 18, 1975, the Lutz family moved into 112 Ocean Avenue. They would last 28 days. Before they moved their belongings in, George called a Catholic priest, Father Ralph Pecoraro, and asked him to come bless the house. Father Pecoraro arrived on moving day. He went from room to room, performing the traditional blessing. Holy water, Latin prayers, the ritual of consecrating a new home. He reached the second floor, a room that would become the sewing room, small, tucked under the eaves. He raised his hand to sprinkle the holy water and heard it. A voice, male, aggressive, unmistakable. Get out. Father Pecoraro spun around. The room was empty. He was completely alone. He left the house immediately. He didn't finish the blessing. He didn't tell George and Kathy what had happened. Not that day. He called George later and told him, vaguely, that he should avoid that particular room. That something wasn't right about it. That room would later become the place where the most disturbing phenomena in the house seemed to originate. The room where Missy, the 5-year-old, would spend hours talking to her new imaginary friend, a friend she called Jody. The first thing George noticed was the cold. Not the cold of a house in winter. He knew that cold. This was something else, a chill that lived in certain parts of the house regardless of the thermostat setting, regardless of how high he turned the heat. Certain rooms, certain corners, certain spots on the staircase, where the temperature would drop suddenly and inexplicably, and you would walk through them and feel the cold slip inside you like a blade. The heating bills were catastrophic. George burned through over $1,000 of heating oil in the first 2 weeks alone, an extraordinary amount. The heat simply seemed to disappear somewhere inside the house. He also couldn't sleep. Every night, without fail, George Lutz woke at 3:15 a.m. Wide awake, heart racing, every sense sharpened to a point. He would get up, check the house, find nothing, and be unable to return to sleep. By the end of the first week, he had the hollowed look of a man being slowly emptied from the inside. He told himself it was stress, new house, new mortgage, a lot of responsibility. He kept getting up. On the 5th night, he walked down to check the boathouse by the river. He didn't know why. Some cold, he would later say, like being called. In the boathouse, he found the source of the rocking sound he'd been hearing. Nothing. There was nothing there that should be making any sound. But as he stood in the dark boathouse at 3:15 a.m., staring at the black surface of the Amityville River, he had an overwhelming feeling. And he was not a man given to feelings like this, that something was standing just behind him. He turned around. The boathouse was empty. He went back inside and didn't sleep again until dawn. It was Kathy who first noticed that something was wrong with Missy. The little girl had always been social, imaginative, quick to laugh. In the new house, she changed. She became quieter. She spent long stretches of time in her room, murmuring to herself. When Kathy asked who she was talking to, Missy said Jody. At first, Kathy thought nothing of it. 5-year-olds have imaginary friends. It was normal. But Jody wasn't quite imaginary in the way Missy described it. Jody, according to Missy, was not a child. Jody was old. Jody knew things. Jody had told Missy things about the house, things a 5-year-old couldn't know, where things were hidden, what had happened in certain rooms, names. And Missy described Jody's appearance with a consistency that made Kathy's skin crawl. Big, floppy ears, beady red eyes, sometimes standing upright, sometimes on all fours. Not a child at all. One evening, Kathy walked past Missy's room and glanced in. Missy was at the window, looking out into the dark backyard. As Kathy watched, Her daughter reached up and pressed her small palm flat against the glass. Outside the window, in the darkness, 2 red points of light were visible, low to the ground, and then higher. As if something had stood up, Kathy screamed for George. By the time he got upstairs, whatever had been outside was gone. Missy turned from the window and looked at her mother with an expression no 5-year-old should wear. Patient, knowing, almost adult. "Jody says you don't need to be scared," Missy said. "Jody says this is her house." By the second week, the phenomena escalated. Green, gelatinous slime began to appear. It oozed from the keyholes of doors. It dripped from the ceiling in the hall. It had no smell, no identifiable composition. George would clean it up, and the next day it would be back. More of it in new places, like the house was producing it. The windows became a problem. Every morning, Kathy would find the curtains torn down. Not pulled, torn, violently, as if something had grabbed them from the other side and wrenched them away. George rehung them. The next morning, torn down again. Flies appeared. In December, hundreds of them, fat, black, buzzing with a particular aggression, clustered in the sewing room upstairs. The one Father Pecoraro had been unable to bless, George called an exterminator. The exterminator found no source, no nest, no explanation. He sprayed. The next day, the flies were back. The locks on the doors began to warp and twist. Deadbolts that had been installed straight were found bent, as if an enormous force had tried to pull the door open from the outside. The front door, solid wood, properly hung, was found one morning hanging off its hinges entirely, wrenched open with a force that left the frame splintered. And the sounds intensified. Not just the rocking chair. Now it was voices, plural, overlapping, coming from the walls, from beneath the floors, from somewhere that wasn't quite inside the house and wasn't quite outside it. George and Kathy would lie in bed, listening to what sounded like a marching band playing somewhere below them in a house that had no basement band room. No explanation, no end. One night, George distinctly heard a woman's voice, not Kathy's, singing a lullaby, coming from inside the walls of their bedroom. He pressed his ear to the wallboard and listened for a long time. The lullaby continued. He never told Kathy about that one. George began to find Kathy levitating. He would wake in the night, always at 3:15, always, and Kathy would be gone from her side of the bed. He would search and find her floating horizontally, 2 feet above the mattress, eyes open but unseeing, expression blank and slack. The first time, he grabbed her and pulled her down. She woke immediately, confused, with no memory of it. The second time, he watched longer before grabbing her. He wanted to understand what he was seeing. He watched for what he estimated to be 2 minutes. His wife, weightless, suspended in the cold air of their bedroom, before he pulled her down again. Kathy also began to change physically. She was aging, somehow visibly. Her face grew drawn and lined in ways that had not been there weeks earlier. Her hair, which had been dark and thick, began to dry out, to dull, to brittle. People who saw her during this period would later remark that she looked like a different person, an older, sicker person. And she began to experience something else, something she would only describe years later, reluctantly, with visible distress. She began to feel possessed. There were moments, usually in the evening, usually near the sewing room, when Kathy would lose herself, when she would look in the mirror and see, briefly, a different face looking back. An old woman's face, withered, hollow-eyed, and wearing an expression of absolute, implacable malice. She started sleeping with a crucifix under her pillow. It didn't help. George Lutz was not a weak man. He had served in the Marines. He was physically large, practically minded, the kind of man who believed in cause and effect, in things he could see and touch and fix with his hands. He had been skeptical of everything that was happening, building alternative explanations right up until the moment he ran out of alternatives. That moment came on the 20th day. He was in the basement, a basement he generally avoided, though he couldn't have explained exactly why when he found the room. It was behind a false wall at the back of the basement. You had to know to look for it. A small room, perhaps 8 feet by 8 feet, with no windows, no ventilation, no apparent purpose. The walls were painted red. Not recently. The paint was old, layered over older paint still, but all of it red. The floor was dirt, just exposed earth. And in the dirt, the remnants of what might have been a ritual space. Symbols carved into the walls, a circle in the dirt. Things that George would later describe to investigators and journalists and anyone who would listen, and which he never quite had words adequate to describe. He stood in that little red room for a long time. He felt the cold there, intense, specific, not the ambient cold of the house, but something concentrated, something almost intentional. He felt the feeling he'd had in the boathouse on the first night, the overwhelming, irrational certainty that something was standing behind him. He did not turn around this time. He walked out of the basement and up the stairs, and he called Father Picararo. The priest told him, finally, about the voice he'd heard on moving day. Get out. George sat at the kitchen table for a long time after that phone call. He looked at the walls around him. He thought about his wife, his children. He thought about the DeFeos, shot in their beds 1 floor above where he was sitting. He thought about the voice his priest had heard. He decided they would leave at the end of the week. The house had other plans. Daniel was 9 years old, and he didn't tell anyone what he saw until years later. He saw it first in the second week. A figure in the corner of his bedroom. Tall, too tall for the room, standing completely still. He couldn't make out features. It was like a shadow that had decided to become three-dimensional, to step out of the wall and just stand there, watching him. Daniel told himself he was dreaming. He pulled his blanket over his head. In the morning, the corner was empty, but it came back. Every night, at the same time, that time, it was there. Sometimes closer than the night before. Once, close enough that Daniel, barely breathing beneath his blanket, could hear a sound he was never able to adequately describe. Like breathing, he would say, but slower than breathing. And colder. He didn't tell his parents. He was 9 years old, and he understood, with the perfect, terrible logic of children, that if he told his parents, it would make it real. He stopped sleeping with the light off. He never slept with the light off again. Not for years. Not until he was old enough that embarrassment finally overcame the fear. And even then, he always checked the corners first. On the 26th day, the house tore itself apart. George and Kathy woke at 3:15 a.m. Of course they did, to a sound like the house itself in pain. Creaking and groaning and something underneath it, all that was neither sound nor feeling, but occupied the space between them. They ran into the hallway, and the cold hit them like a wall. Colder than anything before, cold that burned, cold that made it hard to think. The children were screaming. Every room was in chaos. Doors opened and slammed shut on their own. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees. The green slime was everywhere. Down the walls, pooling on the floors, smeared across the bathroom mirror, in shapes that might have been letters in a language none of them knew. And then they heard it, all of them together, for the first and only time. The voice, not from a specific location, from everywhere. From the walls, the floor, the ceiling, the air itself. Deep and wrong and ancient, in a way that made the word ancient feel insufficient. A voice that said one thing once, in a tone that made George Lutz, Marine, skeptic, protector, feel for the first time in his adult life that there was nothing he could do, that there was no version of this that ended well. You have been warned enough. January 14th, 1976. 3:30 in the morning. George Lutz carried his children to the car. Kathy followed, carrying the dog, a dog that had been shaking and whimpering for days and had refused to enter certain rooms. They put nothing in the car, not clothes, not money, not the things they had worked their lives to acquire. They left everything. They drove to Kathy's mother's house. They didn't go back. George sent a friend later to retrieve a few belongings. The friend reported feeling a sudden, overwhelming terror upon entering the house. An animal panic, sourceless and total. He grabbed what he could in under 10 minutes and left at a run. The house at 112 Ocean Avenue sat empty for a while after that. And it was sold. And the family who bought it, who knew nothing of the Lutzes, nothing beyond the DeFeo murders, lasted a single night. They would not say what happened during that night. They moved out the next morning. In 1977, J. Anson published the Amityville Horror, a true story. It became one of the best-selling horror books in American publishing history. Millions of copies sold. A film in 1979. Another in 2005. Sequels, prequels, documentaries, TV specials, YouTube channels, including, presumably, this one. And almost immediately, the questions began. Were the Lutzes lying? Investigators found inconsistencies. Local police had no record of many of the events described. A neighbor who should have seen phenomena saw nothing. The story had the smell of something assembled rather than experienced. In 2005, a lawyer named William Weber, Ronald DeFeo Jr.'s defense attorney, claimed that he, George Lutz, and Kathy Lutz had fabricated the haunting story together over many bottles of wine. His goal, he said, had been to create grounds for a new trial for his client based on supernatural influence. The Lutzes, he claimed, saw a financial opportunity and ran with it. George Lutz denied this until his death in 2006. Kathy Lutz denied it until her death in 2004. Both maintained until the end of their lives that what they experienced was real. Their children, Daniel, Christopher, and Missy, gave conflicting accounts over the years. Christopher, in a 2013 interview, stated that something had happened in that house, that the experience had been real, that he didn't have words for what it was, but it had been real. Missy, the youngest, the one who had spoken to Jody, stopped talking about it entirely. She has never, to this day, publicly discussed what she saw in that house. The house at 112 Ocean Avenue still stands. It has been renovated over the years. The owners, who have reportedly faced constant intrusion from curious tourists and ghost hunters, made one significant change. They replaced the distinctive quarter-moon-shaped attic windows, the ones that looked, in photographs, so unsettlingly like eyes, with ordinary rectangular windows. The address has also been changed. It is no longer 112 Ocean Avenue. Whether that helps is a matter of opinion. People still go there. They stand on the sidewalk and look up at the house and try to feel something. Fear, presence, the echo of what happened here. Most report feeling nothing, just a house. Just wood and glass and old walls. But some people, and they are always a little reluctant to say this, report something else. A cold, not the winter cold. Something specific. Something that seems to come from the house itself. And sometimes, rarely, late at night, people passing on the road report seeing a light in the upper windows. Not a lamp, not a streetlight reflection. A red light, faint, steady, like a pair of eyes. Watching, waiting. Ronald DeFeo Jr. said the house made him do it. George and Kathy Lutz said the house tried to do it again. Neither explanation is comfortable, because one of them means a man slaughtered his family and invented demons to escape responsibility. And the other means that there are places in this world where something ancient and hungry has taken up residence, something that feeds on families, that waits in walls, that wakes you at 3:15 in the morning and calls you downstairs to where the cold lives. I don't know which is true. I know that 6 people are buried in a cemetery on Long Island, whose names most people have forgotten, because the house is more famous now than the family that died inside it. Ronald DeFeo Sr. and Louise DeFeo and their 4 children, Dawn, Allison, Mark, and little John Matthew. I know that a family of 5 ran from that house in the middle of a January night and never went back, and that whatever they left behind, furniture, money, possessions, peace of mind, they considered a fair trade. And I know that the house is still there, that the new windows don't look like eyes, that the address has been changed, that it looks, in daylight photographs, like an ordinary house. And I know that somewhere, in whatever remains of his consciousness, George Lutz woke every night at 3:15 until the day he died, even after he left, even after he moved away, even decades later, in a different state, in a different house, in a different life. 3:15 a.m., wide awake, heart pounding, listening, sleep well.